So our next talk brings us back to the books. Book Provenance at the National Library of Israel, Research and New Initiatives. We have two speakers. They will not speak together. They will speak one after the other. The first one will be Daniel Lipson, who's been working as a reference and database librarian at the National Library of Israel for the last 10 years, where he instructs researchers on how to use the library online catalogs and database. Last year, Daniel finished his thesis at the Bar-Ilan University on the topic of reception of the Diaspora treasure books at the National Library of Israel. And he also coordinated the National Library Genealogy Service. Together with him, or within his talk, together with him will be Dr. Yoel Finkelman. Yoel Finkelman's personal biography is somewhat longer, and he is a graduate of the Hebrew University. His PhD in Jewish thought from 2003 was based on the thesis of religion and public life in the 20th century American Jewish thought, but he also studied in Yeshiva University in Kollel Meretz, and he is also a graduate of the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. Where does he find the time? And he has been teaching, he's been curating, publishing, lecturing, preparing press releases, working with the Bar-Ilan University, with Midrash Lindenbaum, Jerusalem. He's associate of the Social Scientific Study of Judaism, managing editor, and many, many, many other things that probably keep him very busy. So without further ado, Daniel, you will start, and you will join in.
Right. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. The National Library of Israel was established 130 years ago. The idea being to collect all Jewish texts and literature from around the world in all different languages to one central place in Jerusalem. At the beginning, the library was just one room with a small collection. But when the Hebrew University was opened in 1925, the library became part of the university, and from then onwards was known as the National and University Library, at the time under the management of Dr. Hugo Bergman, previously of Prague University Library. Unfortunately, the National Library doesn't have, or at least we don't have yet, any provenance databases like what we've seen this morning and till now. So I'd like to talk about the old-fashioned way of doing provenance research. Also, unfortunately, with the exception of some manuscripts and archives here at the library, very little provenance information has been added to the library's catalog about any books, not only books looted by the Nazis, but any of our books. So today, I'd like to talk about what can be done, or perhaps the first kind of research that has been done in this field. And I'd like to talk about three different types of library archive material, which I've used in the last few years. The Benkovitz stamp catalogs, the Otzrot HaGola, or Diaspora Treasures Archive, which is the archival material that any researcher, that many researchers have actually used for their research on the topic of the Nazi looted books that eventually arrived in Israel. And most importantly, the library's accession books, which for some reason we call inventory books, which I spent a lot of time using the last 2 years. So as Sarah said before, I assume that many of you are familiar with the historical facts of the looting and the discovery and distribution of the books. But for those who aren't, and for everyone joining us on YouTube, I'd like to tell the story, or retell the story briefly, from a librarian's perspective, and demonstrate the use of these three tools from the 1940s and 1950s. So we know there were many Nazi organizations involved in the looting of libraries and books from all enemies of the Reich, the Freemasons and the Bolsheviks and the Catholic Church, and of course Jewish collections as well. There were many interested in putting their hands on these books, but there were two main competitors. The Reich Security head office, Department 7, created a huge library in Berlin with some 2 million books, collected from Germany and from other places as well. And the other competitor was Alfred Rosenberg, who had a grand idea of establishing a huge academic institute with many research facilities around Germany. The only facility that he actually did manage to create was the Institute for the Research of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. And since every institution needs a library, he created a task force named after him, VRR, that went around Europe looting books from different collections and different institutions and sending them all back to Germany, some to Frankfurt, to the Institute in Frankfurt, and the rest to a central library that was planned to serve other facilities if they would after the war, and around Germany. But Germany was bombed and the books were evacuated. The RSHA evacuated the books eastwards to Czechoslovakia, where many of them were found by the Red Army and taken by the Russians to Belarus and to Russia, where many of them still remain today. But the books found in Frankfurt, at the Institute in Frankfurt, were evacuated north to Hungary. They were found there by the US military, collected, and then sent to Offenbach by Frankfurt, where they were stored in a huge warehouse. And many more books kept on coming in every day. The warehouse was then known as the OAD, the Offenbach Archival Depot. Books were found, they were brought to Offenbach, sorted and repacked, the idea being to return them to the countries from where they had been stolen. And within a few months, they'd been very successful. Seymour Pomeranz, the manager of the OAD, managed to return hundreds of thousands of books to Holland, to France, to other places within a short, within just a couple of months. His successor, Captain Isaac Benkovich, devised a plan how to continue with the work there in Offenbach. Benkovich was a chemist by, he'd studied chemistry in the past, and in a photographic room in Offenbach, he and his team managed to collect stamps, the stamps stamped inside the different books that they had there, and make copies of them, and stick them together in two large albums, or you can call them stamp catalogs. Benkovich donated these two albums to the National Library when he'd finished using them at the end of 1946, where they are till today. As you can see, they're divided into countries, one book being Eastern Europe and the other Central and Western Europe. And for example, if we open up on the page here in Germany, you can see different stamps which have been pasted into this album. Sometimes, like here in Poland, we have a long list of the different institutions, libraries from synagogues and yeshivot and public libraries that had been looted and found in Offenbach. So we have a list, and the numbers by the names of the libraries correspond to on next page to the different stamps which were found in the books. So we have a good understanding which libraries were actually looted, and also individuals as well, large collections from private collections. The idea was that the workers that were working in Offenbach, who could only speak or could only read German, these catalogs would help them put the books in the right pile. So if they found a book with a stamp from the Netherlands or from Greece, and they couldn't read Greek, couldn't read Dutch, but he could at least recognize the shape of the stamp or the letters or the color, and they would know which where to put these books in which crates, which would then be sent to Greece or to Italy or to Holland or to other places around Europe. We digitized these 2 volumes a few years ago. They're accessible online through our catalog. At the moment, there's a problem with one of them, a technical problem, but hopefully we'll fix that, and they can be seen from anywhere. In Offenbach, the US Army in Offenbach made their own reports. They sent reports back to America, and they made separate lists of books that they had found with the names of the libraries, and these kept on being sent back as the months went by. Now, before the war was over, the Hebrew University began a committee for the saving of what was called the Diaspora treasures. The university knew that the collections and libraries, Jewish libraries around Europe, had been stolen and looted, and as the Jewish Agency and others were getting prepared to assist the survivors and refugees, the Hebrew University wanted to see if they could take care of the books after the war that would be found in Germany and other places. So one of the first things that they did was in 1946, after the war already, of course, they sent Professor Gershom Scholem, an important professor in the field of Kabbalah from the Hebrew University, to Europe to see what he could find and what collections still exist. Scholem wrote reports, and there's a lot of documentation in the library, in the archive in the Diaspora Treasures archive, from him and from other representatives that went to Europe, and different meetings and protocols of the committee. Even before the war had ended, the first thing that the committee did was to try and find out which libraries had been looted, and they published articles like this in the newspapers. If anybody remembers an important Jewish collection or important Jewish library from anywhere in Europe from before the war, please send the National Library information, because we want to make a list which will help in finding them after the war. And a lot of information came in, which was then collected by librarian Daniel Goldschmidt from the library, who made long lists with extra details, what libraries existed in which towns and what important items they had, what kinds of collections they had. All of this information was later used by the Commission on European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which was founded by Professor Solo Baron from Columbia University. Similar idea, to make lists of different collections from across Europe that probably had been looted, and they printed their list. There was a few supplements of different libraries that they hoped to find, or at least find part of the collections when they could go to Europe. So most of the books from Offenbach were returned, but there remained about 500,000 books that couldn't be identified, and this is where the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which continued the Baron's committee, comes in cooperation of different Jewish organizations from across the world, the Hebrew University and the National Library included. And the idea was to collect all of these books and give them out to different countries and Jewish libraries across the world, as Sarah mentioned before. And there's a lot of documentation, meetings and letters and memorandum from the JCR, different meetings. All of this, together with the Diaspora Treasure Committee from the Hebrew University, is all collected together and can be seen in what we call the Otzrot HaGola, or the OG archive here at the National Library. A lot of this material can also be found in the Hebrew University's archive and in the Central Archive of History of the Jewish People and other places as well. But this is information that every researcher has to use, because this is the actual story. This is where all articles and books come from. When the books were sent out and dispersed around the different libraries, The JCR notified all recipient libraries that they have to stick this label inside each book, meaning that if you find a book with this label in, it means it had been stolen during the Holocaust. And here are some examples from our library. There are many of these books around, all different kinds. Here we have a prayer book from First World War with the stamp of Rosenberg's ERR in it. Here is another book. You see the label and also the organization that stole it, the Reich Institute for History of New Germany. But not only books didn't arrive only from the JCR and Offenbach. The library sent representatives to Europe and who found books in many other places as well. For example, in Poland, and this is the label, the books that a library prepared for books found in Poland. Here from Vienna, books were found and then sent to Israel, Holland, and other places as well. So the JCR and Offenbach is an important part of the history, but only a part of this history. Many books came from other places as well. They were all sent to Israel. The National Library that looked like this before 1948 kept the books that it needed, that were missing from the collection, and the rest, hundreds of thousands of books were given out to different schools and synagogues and public libraries across the country. The last tool I want to talk about is what I used most for my research, the library's accession books. So it worked like this. From 1936 to 1990, whenever any book arrived at the library, first it was checked in a card catalogue to see if we had a copy already. If there already was a copy in the collection, someone would decide if we needed to keep a second copy, and then they would note in the accession book from the first copy that we now have an additional copy, and they would update the catalogue as well, meaning there was a catalogue card, and somebody would add, now we have 2 copies of that book. If we didn't need the book or didn't want to keep the book, it would be sent perhaps to a different library. But if there was no copy in the library, and it could be a book that we have many different editions of, but a new edition which we didn't have, at least then at the end of the 1940s and beginning of the 50s, then a new book would be added to the accession book, meaning a new line would be written with the book. This is a brand new book, an old book that the library didn't have till now, and the book would then be catalogued like every other book in the collection. This is what the accession books look like. I dealt with the Hebrew books, books in Hebrew, in Jewish languages, Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, etc. But this is what the other foreign language books look like. The accession book was like this, and each book would get, each book would get a shelf number, the title of a book, a few details, and the most important column here is how the book actually arrived in the library. And wherever I would find an Aleph Gimel, or in English we could say OG, or Tzot HaGolah, I'd know that this book had been stolen and arrived at the library during the 1950s onwards and 1960s. So this is what I collected. I went through from 1950, when the first books started being catalogued, till 1959, so a decade. There's much more. I started collecting the shelf numbers of these books by going through accession books from 1950, 51, 52, and onwards, and then adding the system number of each book, which I put together in Oracle Analytics, which works on the library's ALMA library system, in order to get information about the bibliographic information about the book, the topics, author, publisher, year, etc., which then could be added to an Excel sheet, and then I could do some bibliometrics on it and try and understand which books the library collected. I'll stress again that these are books that the library needed because we didn't have any collection. Many other books were sent to other institutions, but this is what the library was missing during the 1950s. The next stage is to be able to identify these. Nobody can actually go through the accession books searching one by one. Well, that's what I did, but any other researcher can't actually work like that. So the next stage would be to add this information to the catalog, which we did not long ago. So if this book, for example, we have a note here, some of the copies of this book were looted by the Nazis during the Holocaust and reached the National Library as part of the Diaspora Treasures project, in Hebrew as well. Some of the copies of this book This is because some books, like this one here, we have 14 copies of. Now, one of these books appeared in the accession book, and we know that one of them had been looted, but which one? The only way to know would be to take all 14 books and check them one at a time, which isn't something that the library can do at the moment. But in the case that a book like this is found, I can actually change the note and write that this book, because we only have one copy, for example, was looted by the Nazis, and I can add some additional information. Like in this case, the book has a stamp of the Library for Jewish Community in Berlin. This isn't the actually policy at the moment, but it can be done, and slowly, perhaps we can do this and continue on this important project. So this was actually the first time ever that the library, that we did some kind of provenance research regarding books, definitely books looted by the Nazis during the Holocaust. The first, but hopefully not the last project. And I'm pleased that Dr. Yoel Finkelman is with us, and who will talk about future projects of provenance here at the National Library. So thank you very much. Yoel?
Thank you, Daniel. I want to begin with what amounts to an apology. To put it rather bluntly and embarrassingly, I put this event in my calendar on the wrong day. And so I discovered yesterday that this was not happening yesterday, but today. And I've been trying to juggle other commitments due to this unfortunate mess up on my part. So I apologize that I have not been more involved in the meetings today, particularly regarding some of the databases that were described this morning. So I'll begin with that apology. My name is Yoel Finkelman. I'm the curator of the Judaica collection at the National Library of Israel, and I want to talk about, as Daniel said, something slightly different, less about the past, less about current collections in existing research libraries, and more about accession and collections development for research libraries and special collections around the world. And in particular, I'm going to share a please let me know if you see the screen with my Google Slides here. Do you now see the slideshow? Is that good? Okay, so I'm going to use part of a PowerPoint that I presented for the first meeting of the International Forum on Judaica Provenance, and I want to describe a little bit about this new forum, co-sponsored by the National Library of Israel and the Association of Jewish Libraries, in particular the incoming president of the AJL, Michelle Margolis-Chesner, the Judaica curator at Columbia University. And she and I have been working together. We've been having conversations about the topics of collections development and the ethical questions of provenance for quite a long time, already for years. The National Library of Israel has sponsored over the last 10 years, the National Library has sponsored four conferences for Judaica collection curators from around the world, those who are responsible for collections development in research libraries and archives related to Jews, Judaica, and Israel. At the last virtual meeting that occurred in May 2021, virtual conference, one of the topics of a roundtable was murky provenance and the ethics of collecting. And this is less about what Daniel and what others have been working on regarding tracing the provenance of particular known items already in collections, and much more about the work of curators and acquisitions professionals within research libraries who are struggling constantly with the ethical aspects of provenance. And there's both a kind of universal element to this and a particular Jewish element to this. There's a universal element, which is that when it comes to the world of rare books and manuscripts, special collections and archives, so much of the market is gray. Occasionally it often happens, and that's wonderful when somebody can identify a book or an archive. This is my late wife's archive. She was an important poet, and I would like to donate it or sell it to a research institution. Okay, then things are relatively clear. And then there are situations where things are relatively clear in the other direction. Somebody comes and wants generally to sell a document and refuses to say anything about where it came from, and it's reminiscent of things that are known to have been held elsewhere, or it's identical to things that are known to have once been elsewhere. We were in a situation where somebody offered us the only known copy of several pages of Hebrew in Kunabula, or rather, we thought at the time that it was 3-second copy of a Hebrew in Kunabula. And it's only after we did our due diligence that we were able to discover that these pages were clearly stolen from Library X. Probably we can guess sometime in the 1970s. And then, that's clear in the other direction. And that was something that we did not acquire and add to our collection. And we informed the original library that where these things were currently held, even though actually in that particular circumstance, I didn't suspect the seller. I suspect that the seller had bought it from the thief or several hands removed from the thieves. And so that, then those are the kind of the clear situations. And then there's everything gray in between, in which sellers show up and they say, okay, well, I have this book, or I have this manuscript, or I have these archival documents. Would you like to receive them? Would you like to buy them? And you just can't trace the provenance. Could be that the person's trustworthy, could be the person's not trustworthy. But I know again of another situation in which the entire collection of historical collector X is held in a certain library. A manuscript of that collector went up on auction, and the person in that library told me, we'd like to add it to our collection, but we just can't trace the provenance far enough back. And our board of directors says that if we don't have 100 years or 150 years of accurate provenance information, then we can't acquire a manuscript. And so those are situations kind of gray. He didn't say, I know it to have been stolen. He said, I just can't trace it. And that gets us a little bit into the uniquely Jewish or particularistically Jewish aspect of this, which is that a lot has happened in Jewish history in the last 150 years. And to put it as a way I try to explain this, if we made a list of the 10 or 15 most important Jewish cities 150 years ago in 1872, and we made a list of the 15 most important Jewish cities today in 2022, there would be no cities on both lists. No city that was of major cultural importance, intellectual importance, spiritual importance, artistic importance, demographic importance. No city that was important to the Jewish people in 1772 is still in the center. And that's because of voluntary immigration. That's because of mass murder. That's because of involuntary immigration. That's because of the successes of Zionism and the failures of the Holocaust and everything in between. But the fact is that in the particularly Jewish case, the fact that we can't trace provenance for so many items is pretty hard baked into everything about the system. And it's more shocking when you can actually trace provenance 150 to 200 years back than it is when you can't. And more than that, the constant changes in Jewish demographics and Jewish immigration in the last 150 years means that some of people's natural intuitions about what justice looks like for restitution don't easily apply in the Jewish case. I don't think Jews are unique in this case. I think there's a number of diaspora communities or communities that have experienced displacement who share a lot of this concern. Issues of let's say Native American populations, issues of diaspora communities where the cultural center has moved away from the original geographic center. Let's say groups like Armenians. There are examples of diaspora communities, but the intuition that many people have, which is that geographic restoration is the just thing to do, often doesn't neatly apply in the Jewish situation. To return, to take an example that was in the news just over a year ago, to take Pinkasei Chevra Kadisha burial society documentation that in a central community in Hungarian, let's say, for example, for the sake of the conversation, Hungarian Jewry, and return them to a town in Hungary today, is not necessarily to do justice, particularly if that community doesn't have, or that town doesn't have an active Jewish community or the archival resources to care for the documents. Part of the reason why the National Library of Israel made an arrangement about a year ago with the Jewish Museum and Archive of Budapest to jointly acquire a number of archival documents, in order to ensure that they're cared for and kind of check both the geographic box and institutions that represent in some way the cultural heritage of the Jewish people, even if they're not geographically in the same location. So a lot of people who are dealing in this world of collections development have been struggling with these questions of the ethics of murky provenance, of the gray areas of the market. And what the National Library of Israel has done in coordination with the Association of Jewish Libraries is to put together a team of 12 international experts who are going to be meeting over the course of the next year. And we had our first meeting, you can see from the slide, on the 30th of March. The forum will formulate a coherent set of recommendations for public Judaica special collections libraries and archives when dealing with accession of items with unknown, unverifiable, or disputed provenance. The issue is not only to look at the letter of the law in different countries or international agreements, but also to look more broadly at the ethical questions that we as collections developers face when dealing with items that come for auction or for sale or even for donation when the provenance cannot be traced. How do we make these decisions? What are the factors to account for? How much lack of knowledge? When does lack of knowledge mean, to use the rabbinic term, safek lechumra or safek lekula, a doubt one should be stringent or a doubt one should be lenient? What are the factors that are going to go into decisions? Because there's no morally neutral position. Not acquiring something for a special collections public collection is as morally perilous as acquiring something with sketchy provenance, because if public collections that have proper facilities for caring for things, for digitizing them, for making them available to the public, to researchers, to lay people, if they're not the ones who are collecting these items, then they're going to go into the black market. They're going to go underground. And they'll go to private collectors who may or may not cooperate either with the law or with the research community. So in a situation where there's kind of no morally neutral stance, how do we make good decisions? We're not so much trying to issue binding conclusions that would be, legally require anybody, but at least a kind of ethical statement for the field, which even if people disagree, and it's fine to agree to disagree, people will be able to look at it as a point of thought. The core values with the people on this committee are sharing is open shared material and maximum public accessibility. We value public accessibility, transparency in acquisitions, that whatever decisions get made, the information should be available and should not be hidden. We believe in strong advocacy of public interest, best served by collaboration between public and private stakeholders, meaning we do not begin with the assumption that private collectors are the bad guys. We also don't begin with the assumption that public collectors are the bad guys. I think sometimes the critical distinction is not between public and private, not between Jewish institutions and non-Jewish institutions. The critical distinction is actually between responsible and irresponsible. There are private collectors who are responsible, more transparent, cooperate with public collections, digitize their collections, make them available. And then there are public collections that deaccession things without telling the public, or don't care for their collections, or hide them from researchers. We are, of course, value protecting and preserving Jewish cultural heritage. I don't think I need to explain that in great detail, but we believe in that very firmly. And of course, that decisions should be based on ethical as well as legal considerations. Public institutions should not do anything illegal, excuse me, and public institutions should not do anything unethical. And those don't always line up. Could be that something is legal and unethical, and it could be that something is unethical and legal. And let's try to make as good and transparent and wise decisions as we can within that. We've divided this group into two teams. One team dealing with theory. What are the historical precedents are there for our work, especially but certainly not limited to post-Holocaust looted material, but also to material from the Islamic world, where obviously there have been major demographic changes, from the mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to other places in the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, historical precedents in terms of post-colonial thinking on restoration and the ethics of Western institutions, especially relative to the global South, but not only. We're interested in theoretical questions. What do we mean when we say cultural heritage? What do we mean when we say public ownership of cultural heritage? What exactly do we mean by those terms? How does that interplay with private ownership? How does that interplay with personal or family memory? We're interested in what models of justice exist regarding provenance, both at the practical level, what other ethical statements have been made by museums and by archives and by libraries, and in general, what ethicists and practitioners think of justice regarding this area. Obviously, the relevant ethical and legal issues. That is kind of one team, and then there's a team dealing with the practical questions. What can we learn from examples of acquisitions which our team members have struggled with? Who are the actors in the provenance ecosystem? Collectors, innocent bystanders, governments that have made ethical decisions in the past and since changed their mind, auction houses, which are often not transparent, sellers, some of whom are more reliable than others. Who are the actors in this ecosystem, and what are their interests? What kind of behavior do we expect from them in terms of their interests? What are the potential conflict points, and what can we do to minimize those conflict points or to address them when they can't be minimized, and kind of describe what it is that public institutions are doing today. Different public institutions have different policies. Some public institutions have no policy, stated or otherwise. So what are people doing today, and what ought they be doing in the future? Our goal is to meet over the spring and early summer for learning. And then this will probably continue more deep into the summer, and then in late summer and fall to work on drafts of a document before we begin to find individuals and institutions who are willing to back this kind of document, sign on it, or see themselves orbiting around it in some way or another. Again, our goal is not Our goal is not to issue binding statements as much it is to have a much more public conversation about what collections development does look like today and what it ought to look like regarding public collections. And for that reason, the National Library of Israel and Michelle Margolis Chesner of Columbia University / the Association of Jewish Libraries, why we've put together not just our own two heads, but also I've been having conversations with Daniel within our own institution, but also we've brought experts from North America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America to this team, so that we can bring the voices of as many and as diverse a group of people as we can. Thanks.